Welcome once more to Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia, your channel for a bit of brain exercise as we retrain you to think about Australian railways in a different way, with your regular host, the Mad Professor. We're back in the suburbs of our large cities, and we'll visit several different places today to illustrate the problem of dealing with the harm our friends can do. So many of us have been brought up to believe a load of tosh about Australian railways. It is everywhere, and that's no accident, as it was done by those who stood to gain from all this tosh. If we want to see Australian railways get better, we better be sure we are not spreading this around ourselves. Look at Dodger here. If he dropped his waste here, and it stayed here for someone to walk through, that person would end up walking into their house, their workplace, or wherever, spreading dog poo around. Not that that person would mean to do it, but the result is the same. And you can do that too with railway tosh. Spread it in the environment unknowingly. And some of our best friends are doing it. Take for example urban planners, urban planning academics, and urban planning enthusiasts we see on YouTube. They all mean well. They join the transport advocates in trying to push for people to live a better life, especially in towns and cities. Many of those towns and cities may have bad transport, including bad rail, or no rail, and that adds to making life in those places bad. So of course we want to see as much information as possible being spread around, to help the public realise it doesn't have to be that way. But it is no good if they spread information that turns out to be harmful to rail, without knowing it. The narrative draws an unhelpful link between bad urban planning and bad transport policy. And it's not that there is never such a link, just that it can be overstated. We will explore more of why that might be later in this episode. And of course, we want good urban planning. But neither does a good urban plan presuppose good transport, nor does good transport presuppose good urban planning. Some Australian thinkers may be influenced by North American commentators, people like Not Just Bikes or Alan Fisher. Within their own realm, they are a great commentary, drawing on the Jane Jacobs legacy. She wrote the famous book Death and Life of American Cities, and was one of the first to call out how poor urban planning and poor transport, making all Americans poorer, whether the working poor who are now left with pitiful public transport, or the middle class, who are now required to own multiple cars and spend many hours a day in them if they lived and worked in a city. And this is the wellspring from which the river of American urban commentators on the left have made a flood. Some have branched out into cycling advocacy, fixing what Americans call their missing middle. That is, townhouse or apartment buildings that fill the gap between single-family detached housing and high-rise apartments, which Americans call condos. Topics as diverse as food deserts and racial segregation by zoning attract interest from across the left, and also from right-wing trolls who come to justify the status quo. North America really does have some poor urban planning, though just as we see in Australia, your Mad Professor suspects that the link between urban planning and good transport is not as strong as they make out. And the US in particular has a problem with its urban planning. Their local councils have far too much power over zoning, and the corruption that drives it in practice. And the USA has some darker and deeper issues with urban planning. The original zoning ordinances might have looked like something aimed to make middle-class life better, but had the true intention of reinforcing racial segregation and making life harder for black people, at a time when court decisions and national politics were running the other way. And in some cities, proposals to improve public transport, especially rail, particularly in the South, are attacked in a way very thinly disguised, but racially motivated. We saw in our episode 8 Who Blamed Roger Rabbit, an effort to blame the motoring lobby for the loss of rail transport in the USA. But in truth, rail interests actually caused the suburbanisation of the USA in the early 20th century through the wanton expansion of light rail systems by private developers, none of which could really turn a profit for them. When that money ran out and motor cars became widespread, those lines all failed, leaving vast suburban areas dependent on cars or a token bus. Countries that had government involvement in rail transport provision, like our own, never had that justification. But through US influence, many of our advocates are led astray and lead others astray. Of course, we know of good examples of urban planning. For example, Singapore, which we visited in our episode 4, Muddling Through. The Singaporeans famously don't muddle through, but aim for rational policy development and make explicit the links between rail transport and the urban plan, as we see here in Singapore's northern suburbs at Woodlands. However, good urban planning is not a precondition for good transport. You will hear so many say, this city or that town can't get rail transport because it is badly planned, which is not right, both in theory and in practice. US commentators would never credit a place like here in Silicon Valley as having an urban form made for rail transport, but in fact it does have rail transport, whether we mean the BART system on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay, or Caltrain on the peninsula, or the line running up to Oakland, or Amtrak, or even the future high-speed rail, and the Santa Clara light rail system. None of them are really good, and all could be improved singly or together as a machine ensemble. But to say the bad urban planning results in no entitlement to rail transport, no possibility of it, no actuality of it, is just completely wrong. We have our own examples of that too. The Gold Coast has a light rail system down the built-up coastal strip, but it does reach out into the burbs on its way to Helensvale. And from Helensvale north and south we find the QR electric system. Again, neither are perfect, but neither represent a no-rail mindset in theory or in practice. Really, this argument is just a variation of the population and density one we saw in our episode Australians, Are You Dense? Instead of arguing that there aren't enough people, but they aren't concentrated in the right places, this time they're saying that people need to be in exactly the right place. Certainly a supporting argument, but hardly persuasive. Good urban planning is worth doing for its own sake, to make life in cities more pleasant, more diverse communities, more amenity close at hand like shops and parks, reducing stress and pollution, and making our interactions with other people, which we must do if we're going to have cities, as pleasant as possible. Assuming a good transport network is already there, including rail infrastructure like lines and stations, then the urban planner has a lot to offer in shaping city design around that transport. That will both make the urban life better by using transport to its fullest, but also help the transport network to be used efficiently. In our recent episode, Back on Track, we looked at a 7-point scale for how well a rail system can serve its community, and we will refer to this scale a bit in this episode. And it helps us to understand the fairly loose connection between urban form and rail transport. If you want a good urban transport channel, try Reece Martin's RM Transit. He runs out of Toronto. But with a good broad outlook across the world, good urban planning is certainly a boon for transport, where transport needs it, but not a precondition. At the end of the day, good transport decisions need to be made irrespective of urban plans. Bad urban plans, which are dependent on cars, start to fail. The rail transport, if it exists, will come into its own anyway. Urban design can support this, but is not the be-all and end-all. Rail planners must always make the best decisions for a rail network, irrespective of what the urban planners do. Urban planners sometimes stray into transport debates, and rail in particular, without the technical knowledge they need to make a useful contribution. That is no surprise, as rail is very expensive and a source of many dollars for both infrastructure but also policy development. If you're developing urban planning policy, you would be crazy not to hang around to see if some of these dollars come your way. Understanding how public transport works, particularly rail, is a science in itself. Your mad professor prescribes the Vucic textbook, which we see here. Pity the poor transport student with bad math skills. But this is how you understand how rail works. Headways and acceleration curves, vehicle densities and so on. The urban planner wandering into the debate, inspired by the memory of their latest trip to Europe and how cool the trams were, is likely to be parading their ignorance, and we see this on the YouTube channels. The difference between good and bad passenger rail transport can hinge on these factors. How many people can my system carry in an hour? How many does it need to carry? What you need and what is good value for money is not an aesthetic choice, not something based on your feel or your fun trip to Europe. You will see urban planners criticising architects. They rightly criticise the notion of architectural aesthetics. When architects design pretty but otherwise useless buildings in the public realm, and it is well that they do criticise them. Look at Melbourne's Southern Cross Station, for example. But when these urban planners are making similar sorts of mistakes born out of ignorance in the public transport space, they think they are making good transport arguments. But really, they are just making aesthetic arguments. This is when we see the howlers such as the trackless tram, also called a bus, or monorails, or mismatching the use of so-called light rail or heavy rail. As we saw in our episode 6, What's in a Name? The difference between light rail and heavy rail is a poor guide to planning or technical design. You're best off saying what you want to see, not worrying about what it is called, or advocating imprecisely for commuter rail systems or mass transit systems or whatever, or an unfounded belief. A bus can do everything, or a train would be nice to ride on, when neither are good reasons for putting in a bus or a train. At the end of the day, some of their concepts are just aesthetic rather than practical. A noted Melbourne urban commentator and academic wanted all of Melbourne's rail lines elevated on pylons. Again, this is a decision that would hang on transport practicalities. Number of passengers carried per hour and at what speed. What chances of delay and its duration. And of course the cost. There isn't going to be much difference in transport capacities between elevated and at-grade railways, and none between elevated and underground. But the cost will be starkly different. If we were going for these expensive above or underground options, we would need to see much better results overall in terms of passengers carried. But I doubt this commentator really cared. He was in it for the aesthetics. They often make the mistake of how they think about suburbia. We may do a future episode asking what suburbia really is, the way we did in our episode 6, when we got the help of wise men in ancient China and ancient Greece, to understand whether what we name things really gives us power over them. If we don't know what we mean by the word suburb, how can it be useful to describe any urban planning problem or transport problem? Our urban planning friends might well be using names like suburb as proxy for the concept of density, itself a spurious concept. When Vucic takes his students through questions about how much demand for a rail system there will be, the only data you should be using is data you have directly measured: road usage, journey origin and destination, potential for mode share change, relative prices and so on. Whether this demand comes from a city, a town, suburb, village, hamlet, or farmstead hardly matters. Just the quantum. When we look at a Sydney suburb like Newtown or Melbourne's Collingwood, are we meaning the same thing as Sydney's Leppington or Melbourne's Lynbrook? Why would we think that? All have stations and trains stop at them, but the inner and outer suburbs don't seem to have much in common. We will look at that as a transport problem in a future episode. But today we see it as an urban planning problem. Urban planners think that rail transport might be needed at different levels, based on how they understand urban form. They are wrong. Some outer suburbs and peri-urban towns look hopelessly sparse to the urban planner. Suburbs with no cohesive form or centre. Densities that are very low as houses sit on large blocks. Places where it is unlikely you'll be able to easily walk around to get to your daily needs. Or catch a train. Your mad professor thinks this is a major misreading of the truth. This is distorting how these urban planners think about transport. Even the worst suburbs in Australia would not be a lot different from European ex-urbia, or for a good example, Japan, where thousands of small villages or ex-urban sprawl zones nonetheless have access to good rail services. How is it we see electric multiple units running through rice paddies up and down the country? And what do we mean by ex-urbia? These settlements are very poorly defined urban form outside the larger urban centres. Those ones don't really seem to be their own town or part of another, where urban growth in the countryside is neither connected to an existing larger town, nor is it centred around a historic smaller town. Long settled countries like Japan will have their form of ex-urban settlement. That is, informal hamlets adjacent to larger towns and villages. But they also have our form of it. Big box superstores along wide highways that are there because of the low-cost land. Or we can go to another traditional country and see how the French do it. Here is Val de Reuil, outside Paris, a master-planned town from the 1970s, but master-planned in all the worst possible ways. Low density, single story, wide roads and so on. Canberra in Normandy. It is on the main line to Rouen and has a station which many but not all trains stop at. It reminded your mad professor of somewhere like Warnervale. Its rail service could be better, but it's enough. It's pretty infrequent. When trains do come, they are fast and convenient. You have the choice from here of Paris or the provincial capital at Rouen. So even the Europeans have some pretty ordinary ex-urbia. That doesn't stop them putting the rail in where needed. The nearby little village of Saint-Pierre-du-Vauvray lost its stopping services some years ago, though the station is still there. People in this part of the world have to use infrequent buses or their own cars to get around. The main station at Val de Reuil has the bus interchange and a large car park. We should not go around arguing that our peri-urban fringe is any less deserving of good services. Even places like this get something when there is a consensus in favour of rail, irrespective of the urban form. In episode 12 we found that the lowest proper rail service, our level 2, still merits 2 trains a day, and our level 3 gives us the ability to commute from the smallest rural settlements. In Victoria we have the line from Ballarat to Maryborough, once thought lost to passenger rail, but it has returned. While Maryborough is a good-sized town, the villages en route of Clunies, Creswick and Talbot are all pretty small. Yet we can feasibly commute by rail from Creswick into Ballarat, or if you are keen, to Melbourne. Talbot is a historic town, which means it had a rail station at its core. But even then, it is still pretty low density, and it's not exactly transit-oriented development. We could call it ex-urban or non-urban, or whatever we like. But it doesn't change anything. Maybe in future years the town planners might want more stuff around the railway. Maybe mixed-use development or some units. But really nothing will change what Creswick is. It's just the choice that governments have to make to provide rail. It is currently running at level 3 in our schema, but could be readily moved to level 4, which we would call rural interurban, giving it a minimum of 2 hourly service, maybe 9 such services a day. That opens it up to many more journeys of convenience, to work, school, shops or friends. We are not going to decide today whether it should be upgraded to level 4. It's hard to see any damage done if we did. Maybe another train crew will be required. Certainly no new facilities will be, nor will more rail cars, which sit in the Maryborough siding for much of the day. It's a good example of how we can make a decision to improve rail services independent of the town plan. And of course, urban planning and transport planning can engage in a friendly tug of war, and even a relatively poor rail service will still benefit from clustering suitable land uses around the station. And the reverse. That is, that good transport can benefit urban planning, delivering likely customers to shops and other community facilities. A city like Townsville, we see here, would benefit from a better rail service, bringing people in from suburbs and outlying towns, without depending on cars. It has a few trains a week. Disgraceful for such a large city. So why do urban planners get led astray? We need to watch who they are. Sociology 101. A lot of avoidable political conflict caused by urbanists, idealising an urban form based on their appreciation of inner city life, one that suits their own tastes and preferences. For example, most are more likely to have gone to a university like the one near Newtown, lived in its small houses and apartments, and patronised its shops and cafes, much more likely than the one nearest Leppington. This is a story of social class. Class narratives are always difficult to nail down, they are mostly emotion. But we can talk about things that are very concrete. The jobs people do, what those jobs require, and what education levels people have. The working class by definition work with their hands. Physical work. Society has tended to sort people into geographic areas based on income and preferences, and it is no surprise that we see so many working people in the outer suburbs, where land is cheaper and housing can be bigger. If we define a middle or upper middle class as those working with their minds, undertaking informational and analytical jobs, which are generally better paid and require a more formal education, these people can drift to the more expensive housing closer to the CBDs. The CBDs themselves exist for the benefit of business and government, to concentrate information and skills into a small place. They benefit from this information concentration, and this urban concentration has always benefited rail systems. But information and analysis industries need this information flow to spread by osmosis among the information workers. This happens through the way middle class people socialise, in cafes and restaurants, small-scale shops and other recreation. And people in this class also want to meet their peers in such places. The working class, on the other hand, socialise and recreate to let go of their jobs. While the middle class need the stimulant of coffee to boost their attention, the working class prefer alcohol to blunt it. Shops and catering are for the more prosaic option of getting what you need. Both these broad characterisations influence the urban design that each class prefers. The working class certainly do not want a world of small shops and cafes only accessible by rail, and the constant push for such a world from the middle class, especially academics, only causes friction between the classes. And from which social class do our urban planners hail? Of course, from the middle class. People whose minds are their assets, along with their expensive middle or inner suburban properties. They do not believe they are impacting on the lives of others in their benevolence, but are too blind to see. And worse, it then causes some louder working class advocates to hate inner urban people and their rail systems. Everyone feels they should be benefiting from government largesse, or not paying as much tax. But they see the rail system being paid for by everyone, but only used by people with convenient access to it, to reach the dense urban cores. And this is a failure of rail systems, not meeting the needs of all people, which is why this channel has never bought into those inner urban narratives. If the rail system needs to find a way to be relevant to the outer suburbs and countryside, then let it do so. Stop limiting train services in the way that governments do. Some urban planners might not believe they are causing this, but they give those in government the language and the permission to do so. by equating good rail transport with good urban design. So to make rail relevant to the outer suburbs, follow the Mad Professor's prescription. We need those minimum level 3 services to every feasible place, whether Ingham from Townsville, Adelaide from Tailem Bend, or Tocumwal from Shepparton. Look for all services, not just journeys to work. A working class person may catch the train to the footy on the weekends, or to visit the shops in the Big Smoke. Anything really. In a future video, we will look at the notion of peak hour in Australia that has led our railways astray, over-investing in the peak travel demand to the expense of everything else. For now, we need to realise that a useful system is probably better than a high-capacity one, in both value for money, but also better for maintaining a rail system's social licence. In other words, making it a system for all. We have talked about successful rail projects, new ones and rejuvenations, like the one we saw in episode 7, Where the Wildflowers Grow, where Perth has been both rescued from oblivion and extended into a mix of new and old suburbs. Perth is no poster child for urban planning, yet rail has been quite successful, bringing people from sparsely settled outer areas into the CBD and renewing that social licence. For now, we leave you thinking through all that you've heard so far about the false narratives. We do not need the North American narrative of evil road lobbies, racially discriminatory zoning, towns unfit for rail. They do not apply in Australia. We do not need urban planners or enthusiasts peddling, even unwittingly, the narrative that towns are too small, poorly planned, or filled with working class people who should not get rail services. And they should not rope rail transport into their campaign for making the outer suburbs into the inner ones. This channel has proposed the 7-level scale and suggests that any settlement on a current rail line that can be within 1.5 hours of a city of 50,000 or more should have at least a level 3 service, for equity reasons if no other, and those lines that are disused or could be readily put back should be. And of course that is the minimum. Some cities, the likes of Canberra or Sunshine Coast, have no historic rail system to fall back on and will need well planned and executed new systems. They will cost many billions. We better get started. Next time on Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia, we've been burning the midnight oil to fight political false narratives. Politicians lie about their opponents and mislead about themselves. That's not news. But why do enthusiasts, overlooking the success of the opposing party and forgiving the failings of their own? This politician knows what's wrong with the enthusiasts. Next time, in short memory. See you then.